Hi everyone and welcome to Community Meetup number 15. We're going to hear all about Orleans 2.0 from the core team, including Sergey and Jason and Julian and anyone else who is going to contribute. So I shall stop there and let Sergey take over, who's going to drive it with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So it's kind of holiday times and people starting disappearing, so I wanted to make sure we do it before holidays. The reason the title is Long and Winding Road to 2.0, because if you look at the history, the meetup we had about 2.0 plans was, I believe, in August last year. And at the time, the hope was that would be really fast, but obviously it was not that easy with all the changes in .NET Core and whatnot. So now we are getting close to releasing the final version of 2.0 release, and that's when it makes sense to I think recap what's there, what the changes are, and there's still time to accept some feedback and make some changes. I think Benjamin is saying he can't see the deck. Oh. Okay, so I'd like to start with just a glance at how the project is going on GitHub. So I took a snapshot, I think last night. For the last month, we merged 82 PRs, and it says excluding merges, 19 authors, push 66 commits, and there are a bunch of new issues and closed issues. So that's the community effort, because obviously the core team is much smaller than 19 people. So I want to start by thanking you for these contributions.
By the way, now you're not sharing the right slide, I think. It's only showing the first one.
Oh, I can see the thank you. So perhaps you'll be a little behind.
Now too.
Yeah.
Okay, so cool. You are behind.
Okay. Sorry.
Regardless of what slide you see, thank you for all your help, contributions, and by contributions I mean they come in different forms, in forms of pull requests, in terms of comments on pull requests, in terms of issues, ideas, comments, tests, everything. So we couldn't be where we're at without everybody's help. So to recap 2.0, the core goals were and continue to be its compatibility with .NET Core. Not only because that's new and shiny and a cool thing in the .NET ecosystem, but it's meant to be cross-platform. It's meant to be much more nimble, componentized, lightweight, and performant. So anything has to support .NET Core these days. It's obvious, I think. But we also want to use it as an opportunity to modernize the code base, because when we went open source, people gave us frowns about this code generate factory classes, and I think we learn from the feedback and we improve quite a number of things. But this is an opportunity, was an opportunity to take it to the next level. And here there's just a high-level list of kind of fluid API for configuration. Everything is injectable through DI for better flexibility, or as much as possible is injectable, and for testability. Breaking some components into smaller pieces for better configuration, what you want to run when, instead of some large components. But also, historically, Orleans was solving a bunch of problems that were not generally solved in the platform. And now, after like several years of the code base existed, some of this functionality, the capabilities are available as part of .NET framework, as part of other libraries like ASP.NET brought a few libraries for shared use. And so we want to leverage those capabilities as much as possible and get out of business of things like logging and tracing. And that's also part of this effort to leverage the platform. As we've been working on 2.0, we added a few more goals as we discovered an opportunity to bring transactions. So Phil Bernstein, he's on the call. He's been working on transaction on the side for, I believe, a couple of years before he brought it for the serious consideration for merging into the code base. And time-wise, it aligned with this release, and Jason later will talk more about transactions. As part of working in transactions, we designed a new composition model because previously we relied on base classes, and obviously with no multiple inheritance, it doesn't work, and in general creates a bunch of problems. So there is a new model that we're first using for transactions, but it's a general purpose model for composing various features and functionalities in the application. Then containers became much more prominent. It was obvious that they were becoming a big thing years ago, but in the last couple of years, everyone wants to run, seems like, on Docker in some fashion. And that's what we kind of added some of this testing and improvements to this roadmap. So this is a copy of the slide from that August last year meetup we had with the approach that we discussed, the kind of typical for at least the Microsoft speak, and I'm sure it's outside of Microsoft as well, crawl, walk, run. So 2.0 is the crawl phase where we get everything .NET Core compatible, but generally we tested it on full .NET on Windows as the primary target. And then the walk phase is when we start seriously testing everything, run all our tests on .NET Core. And then the run phase when we go cross-platform and do the same level of testing on non-Windows platforms. So 2.0 completes the crawl phase as planned, so nothing here changed, but we also spilled over to the walk phase. So for example, building .NET Core now happens in CI. And thanks to help from communities, some of the testing is happening on .NET Core and even on non-Windows. So even though the plan stays the same, with community's help, we're doing more than we planned for, which I think is only good. So this is another slide from that old deck that I dug up about what we planned for crawl. And if you look at this list, most of the points stayed valid. The only thing, like binary serializer, what was gone and then was brought back in, that kind of contributed to some of the work we've done on serialization that later wasn't needed, but still it was a good effort to revamp serialization and improve it quite a bit. But the point here is that the plan kind of stayed mostly the same, and we executed on this plan. So some of the major changes. So the big changes are in how we configure. So from essentially, let's transition from doing XML-based file configuration to programmatic config object, and now adopting much more fluid and flexible and more modern way. We're moving away from scanning folders for application code that we've been doing it for all these years, where we just find every assembly, try to load, try to inspect, and find the right time. But people have been complaining about, oh, my application folder has 150 assemblies and it takes forever to scan them all. And in general, that's an error-prone approach where some of the types are not meant to be loaded or scanned. Switching to a much more explicit model, and Julian will talk more about that. And for some of these efforts, we leverage the ASP.NET core components and principles to align and simplify developers' life, because they're already familiar with some of these approaches as part of .NET Core or ASP.NET Core efforts. So I guess that's Julian's part. Julian, are you ready to take over?
Yeah, sure.
Let me know when you want to switch slides.
Okay. Yeah, so actually, this is one of the things that is currently in flux right now between the beta 2 and the final that we will put out, because we did a lot of the plumbing needed for this to work, but now we are actually migrating all the components to basically not rely, as Sergey said, on the XML configuration objects, which now we call legacy config objects, and use more the Microsoft Extensions options provider that where basically allows you to configure from an external declarative store that's XML, JSON, whatever, or even blobs, or like with strongly typed. As you can see there, I created a snippet of what we envision once we port most of the stuff. And as you can see, there's a mixture of stuff. You can see that for configuring the silo, that's straightforward. It can also come from an XML config or some other backend store. As you can see, for example, in the add event hub streaming, that in that example, I mixed two configurations. So basically, it works. Some things are coming from whatever the configuration store is, which can be a series of fallbacks, plus enhance it with programmatic config. So basically, all the control is on the developer of what knobs they want to expose for their DevOps, for example, and what needs to be fixed in the code, as well as we do not own the config subsystem, which is a good thing, because as this evolves in the community and any ASP.NET, this is the same thing that the ASP.NET team uses. We get the benefit of just getting support for them basically out of the box. The other part that you see there, as Sergey mentioned, is that we are now explicit of which assemblies we load. It doesn't mean that we do not support scanning the folder as we did today, but if you want to do that, there's an extension method that allows you to explicitly load from the application directory. So, and for example, that option is not something that we do not recommend. It is useful, especially to get up and running very fast. But if you have a solution with hundreds of DLLs, then you can be more explicit of what you do. We also enable runtime codegen basically as an opt-in. Previously, it was kind of confusing when runtime codegen worked. Whether the assembly for runtime codegen was there, then it means that it would use it. Now you explicitly tell it that you want to run codegen, and even you can tell it, I want to run codegen on this specific assembly or this set of assemblies. So the user has a lot more control. As you can see there in the last line also, it's just the standard way of configuring logging in ASP.NET MVC. So a lot of our documentation will deal with migration, but then how to use logging will say, okay, it's exactly the same as you would do it in ASP.NET, so you can read the documentation there too. This has a parity also with the client builder, and also we've been in talk with the ASP.NET team a lot. So soon they will create a host builder that is generic, that is not coupled to ASP.NET itself. And we have, and that's coming, I believe, in 2.1 of their releases. So once they, and that's in a few months, I believe. But the point is, once they release that, we plan to migrate to that. Whatever we did here is a little bit temporary, but we align a lot with their API, and some code is directly their code. So the point is that even though we do expect a little bit more churn here, it should be straightforward because we already started aligning with them in many of these scenarios. We also and this is a two-way thing. So, for example, we are using the options, as I mentioned, and in our scenario, we have a ton more options, and especially named options, which they don't use. And why I say this, for example, each provider is named, it's not a singleton, so you might want to configure 2 blob storage providers, and they will not share the same option. So it was a little bit convoluted on how to use named options in those scenarios, so we are already contributing back to their repo, and they are releasing stuff with our improvements too. So leveraging their stuff is, I guess, a win both ways. And the other big win here is that since we are dropping, well, we are not dropping support, we will have it for back compat, but since we are not relying on the XML configuration, the legacy cluster configuration, That one was very declarative, and like it provides some limitations. Like sometimes when there's a third-party extension, you have to refer by type name. Like this is a lot more straightforward. Somebody can just create a provider, even if it's not in the main repo, and it would show up as an extension method, which is undistinguishable from first-party extensions, as well as like it enables like a lot of extensibility through because everything is configured in the DI container. So whatever we do, like in theory you can do, and we will start like polishing more and more, so you can even replace key components in the future. Like so yeah, so we did a full revamp. This is not just touching a small section of configuration. This is touching like how Orleans handles DI and integration and configuration. It's a much bigger revamp. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the principle here is to leverage other people's work and focus on where we add value, not on solving problems. So should we move to restructuring, please?
Yeah. So you want to go here, or should I continue?
No, you've been driving this, so
okay.
in the best position
so
to do.
One thing we are starting to invest a little bit, and first we focused on the one that adds the most value, is that we are creating an abstractions package that in theory is the one that you mostly will have to reference in your grain projects and basically in your domain. So we are trying to be a little bit conscious of what we put there so that this package is not versioned very frequently. We cannot probably guarantee that it will not be changed, especially in the first version that we release, because like right now it's like we extracted a few things, but there's improvements that can be made. But the goal is that whenever you need to take a new version of Orleans, you don't have to upgrade many things that could break. Like mainly you will have to upgrade stuff that is in the silo host itself or potentially on the client, but not necessarily on your domain. Of course, if you're building extensions, providers and whatnot, then you probably do need to reference specific versions. And we can improve that in the future too. Right now, the biggest return of investment would be like the abstractions for grain development. Also, your green projects might want to use built-in cogen, which is probably the recommended way of doing cogen. And that one, yes, might be versioned more frequently, but at the same point, it shouldn't impact domain code. So that's the big win.
So let me jump. I would put it this way. So if we fix a bug in the runtime, generally there is no need to rebuild grains. And if we look at largest code bases that like in-house, like with Halo and Gears of War, they have dozens of grain interfaces projects, and they have a handful or like one or two sometimes of host projects. So any fix to the runtime would impact just that those one or two projects, but the rest could stay the same without any change, without upgrading NuGets. So the goal here is to simplify also the upgrade process.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, the next one. It's probably kind of self-evident, but we had this major packages with terrible names like Orleans Azure utils and AWS utils. We are splitting them. I think Azure is already split in beta 2, and AWS is in the process, and SQL or ADO.NET, we call it now. So the goal here, I think, is obvious, to make it more granular. If you just want to use clustering from Azure storage, but you don't care about persistence or statistics, you should be able to use just that piece. Or if you use DynamoDB for persistence, you don't need to bring a lot of classes. And some of them have different dependencies. So that's to simplify, to give you better control over what gets deployed, what dependencies are used. Things like that. I don't think there's much to say here. I guess this picture from Julian's original blog post about leveraging platform functionality. Right, so Julian can talk more about what we're leveraging there.
Yeah, so basically, as we kind of covered already, but we want to focus on what's important for Lean's applications. And in the past, we had to focus a lot of what is also part of the framework of our Leans. Right now, like we are trying to get rid of a bunch of stuff. We are not completely killing them. We are moving them to a legacy package. So if you are invested in some of providers or login or some things like that, we want to be able to support you temporarily, but eventually we will get rid of it in future versions. So the thing is, it allows us to move a lot more quickly, but at the same time, it's not just about us, it's about the community, because it enables third-party extensions that act as the primary thing, because we are also consumers of these same abstractions. I don't know which slide you're on, but right now we are leveraging already logging the dependency injection package, which
on that slide.
One important part of DI that we are leveraging is that we also recently started using scoped services. So each grain, when it gets activated, it gets its own scope in DI, which is very similar if you're familiar with scope services in ASP.NET. Whenever there's a request, like you can share a graph of objects that could be targeted just for that request. And in particular, one big service that we provide, or big, I mean important, is the iGrain activation context, which gives you access to the grain lifecycle, like access to the grain itself, the key. So you could build a lot of generic infrastructure code by just creating a scoped or transient service that leverages that. And this is sometimes talked about with what we call facets, which also they do leverage these scoped services. And in the future, like the persistence, for example, is something that is in a base class, but it won't necessarily have to, because now the runtime gives you access to all the information that any provider or anything would need. So starting from this version, in theory, the persistent provider, the storage providers could have been third-party completely. Like there's nothing that would make it unique because it's in the Orleans code base. I touched on the generic host and options already, so I think we can move forward.
Yep. So the next big part of the story, as I mentioned, we added it to the roadmap opportunistically as we started working with research, Microsoft Research with Phil Bernstein, Sebastian Burkhardt, and transactions. So Jason will talk more about this. One thing, sorry, before we move to transactions, I think last week we put preliminary documentation for TO, which includes migration and details about login. What Julian was talking about, there's already documentation on what's there, how to migrate from, if needed, from where you're at. So don't forget about documentation. Jason, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, take over.
So for transactions, as Sergey mentioned earlier, Phil Bernstein and research group has been developing transactions on top of Orleans in research for a while, and they have in a state where we think it's useful to bring it into Orleans and support it for production environments. And that's much what I've been working on recently. Since transactions are kind of, they mean different things to different people in some ways, I wanted to kind of be clear about what we're talking about for transactions, and that's that we have a distributed system with stateful grains. So what we're doing is operations on top of those grains, those persistent grains, in which all the operations either all apply or all are aborted. So there's no inconsistent states. There's not cases where a couple of the grains are temporarily persisted and then some are not. So the high-level goal of this is somewhat abstract at this point, in that we're merely trying to get a distributed transactions to work in a performant environment in a reliable way. Again, much of this has been done in research, so we're not necessarily building this as much as hardening it for production use and vetting the recoverability of this, and doing some refactoring to make it more maintainable in the future. For the beta version of this, should be going out in Orleans 2.0. We're shooting for supporting up to, or not supporting, we're shooting for testing it and making sure it works for up to 8 grains in a single transaction. There, in theory, this is kind of unbounded. There's no hard limit to this, to the number of stateful grains that can be involved in a transaction, but we wanted to set a limit for testing purposes while we're hardening the system. And we want to make sure that we've verified the correctness, that is, that the states do actually change and everything works as expected. We want to understand the performance characteristics of it and ensure that that the system under crashes and under error states, everything recovers correctly. So all of that is what we're hoping to get done by beta. That doesn't mean that the performance numbers will be where we want them to be, or there won't still be bugs in the system. That's why will be in a beta state. For releases right now, we're looking at the beta in 2.0, and so I made a typo here. I said 2.2 and I meant 2x. Some future version in the 2 series, we want to release Orleans transactions for production use. We do have internal customers that are using this, so this is being hardened in production services. So by the time we release it to the public, it will be used in a production environment, and we will be confident that it works. As Sergey mentioned, we do have some documentation. It's fairly minimal at this point that describes basically how you can wire up transactions to work in your environment, basically how you configure it, because it's an opt-in. It doesn't automatically work. You have to configure the system to use transactions, and the programming model of how you would write grains to take part to be transactional. We also have a sample app in our samples for it, and some benchmarking code in our source tree that developers can tinker with to see what the performance characteristics are on it. Again, this is all it's beta. We're still working on it, but there's enough there that people can start looking at it. That's about it.
So I wanted to stress that we consider transactions functionality a big deal, and it's kind of not unusual for us to go against the common wisdom, because people have been saying that distributed objects have been proven not working. RPC is terrible. Nobody should be in RPC. Likewise, everyone, quote unquote, knows that distributed transactions don't perform, don't scale. So our goal here is not only to solve the problems, then we have an internal customer that want to use this functionality in production soon. But we also want to show that there is no fundamental reason for transactions not to scale and not to perform well. And Phil Bernstein presented this vision, I think, a few times now. He referred to it as actor-oriented database. So if you look at adding all this functionality, we're kind of building almost like object database in a new form, which we believe is totally fine, because we're not really confining anybody into some monolithic database, since all these components are injectable and configurable. That's just set of capabilities that an application developer, we believe, should have at their disposal. Like and with transactions, in the very first scenario comes in, and the internal customer wants to use it for virtual commerce, where you basically need to trade some coins in the game for cannonballs. How do you do it atomically? How do you open a pack in the game where you get several items and you add it to your account? So all those things, they are much closer to financial transactions, where atomicity is important, much more important than in other scenarios. So just wanted to stress that we do think this is very important to have this functionality soon in in the Orleans framework. And this is the last slide we have, really.
Can I just jump in? This is Phil.
Sure.
Just a quick clarification about transactions. Both you and Jason commented on atomicity, but we're supporting all the ACID properties. I mean, it's isolated, durable. It's standard transaction semantics here. That's all.
Yes, it's full ACID transaction. I think atomicity is just the most obvious thing that people don't get when they use storage systems today or eventual consistency solutions. But yes, it's all ACID. And so the last slide, in the beginning, I mentioned how much the community is helping us. And in the near term, the biggest help, like with this release and then subsequent releases, would be helping with walk and run phases. Of course, with all phases, the help is needed, but by helping, making sure that this new cross-platform functionality works across various environments and various application scenarios, that's really tremendous help. Like we published, you probably saw we published beta 2 just yesterday, the day before, and people in the community found issues with F#, and I think Gutenberg and Kathleen, and they pointed to some of the serialization issues. So we can quickly fix them. That Ruben's been on top of that almost like all night. But we can only fix them when we know about them, and because our level of testing outside of full.NET, outside of Windows at the moment is very limited, this is where the biggest help would help us. And we're happy to fix those issues and resolve those issues so that you can run with whatever environment you use, whether it's Orlinka with F#, or if you already run on Docker on Linux. We'd like the code to work even though we're not fully testing it yet. So the containers in Docker, they run on all kinds of environments like Windows and Linux containers in different. Some people use Kubernetes, some people use Swarm, some people use Service Fabric without containers, with containers. So all of that, and of course testing of transactions, that would really help us. So with that, I wanted to thank you one more time and then just start the pre-form discussion, questions, anything, opinions, suggestions.
Yeah, one thing I would mention about helping us test is that some of you are aware, but we recently started publishing nightly builds to MyGet. We can probably share the URL after this, but it means that probably the next day after something got merged, like we will already have a release for you to test. So yeah, it would be awesome if you can help us verify that it works in your environment.
I want to check. I believe the CI URL is in the README and in the repo. Yeah, the link is there. So if you just go to github.net Orleans, scroll down to Orleans builds, there is a link to the MyGet gallery. So any questions, please speak up or type or any form. Are there any plans for indices? The first transactions need to be released. So let me start by saying, yes, transactions need to be released first, and Phil just started effort on porting indices to leverage transactions to make them get them atomically updated with state update. Phil, do you want to add more about indices?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are actually three things that have to be done. The first is we've got to move the implementation that in Orleans contrib onto this new release of Orleans. There's a bunch of breaking changes there, and we need to fix that. Secondly is we need to replace the inheritance model of indices where by dependency injection. So instead of having a grain inherit from indexable grain, instead it's going to use a facet that will offer the indexing functionality. And then, given that we have transactions now, the current implementation uses a reliable workflow to ensure that when you update a grain, an indexed property on a grain, that the update eventually propagates to the index, even if there is a failure somewhere in that path. And now that we have transactions, we can do it all in one shot. So that would be the last step. I don't know whether we might end up making it available before that last step. It depends on how hard it looks, but we haven't gotten to that. Right now, we're just trying to get past the Orleans 2.0 and dependency injection, which is it's going to take a little time. The developer who's working with me on it is just ramping up on Orleans, so it's going to take some months.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Al, for your comments on chat. Any other questions? We've left about half of the time for discussions, opinions, questions.
I have a few small questions, Sergey. First of all, the NuGet packages, like so for abstractions, will they just remain on low version numbers and not be incremented in kind of lockstep with the other packages like it happens at the moment? Sorry, let me clarify my question. At the moment, all the packages kind of increment together, don't they, for the most part?
Yeah, that's how the automation works. What are you asking? That's their ultimate goal?
So with the abstractions, are they going to remain at 2.0, for example, while all the other packages are incremented up, and then at some point they'll then increment up when they change, or are you going to maintain the approach of everything gets incremented together, but there may not be actually any difference in the package?
I think our desire is that abstractions can stay and change only when needed. So, for example, abstractions 2.0 but runtime 2.2, ideally that should work. It's hard to see yet, like if we'll need to make any like additions to abstractions, but that's generally the desire to reach this point where we will not publish all the packages together. We would have kind of process of selecting which packages we update on this release and that release.
Yep.
Yeah, and by the way, for 2.0, that might not be realistic, but yeah, that's the plan. Maybe at some point we will like basically stop updating core abstractions if we can.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And what's the future of the 1.x branch? Is that now dead, or is that continuing to live? Does it have a long and prosperous future, or is 2.0 the replacement?
2.0 in general is a replacement, but if we need it, we're going to have maintenance releases. Like we just published 1.5.3 with one fix for reference assemblies. So we're willing to backport the fixes to that branch because it's no secret that many our users are kind of conservative and stay a few versions behind. So we don't want to kind of drop them and say, hey, you're on your own. No, we want to maintain 1.5.3. It's unlikely that we're going to release 1.6. So that's the current plan.
Okay. Ashkan has asked a question. Shall I read that one out? It says, hey, can you let us know more about Service Fabric priorities? When will we have membership?
Okay, that's a great question. I don't know if Ruben is on the call. Maybe Ruben can explain it better than me paraphrasing him about the difference between clustering and hosting migration.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so currently, I think you know, Ashkan, that we have a clustering provider which allows Orleans to use Service Fabric's naming service in order to find all of the other silos, and also for the clients to be able to find the silos using that naming service. So Service Fabric's internal service discovery thing. But the way that works doesn't really currently fit very well with the rest of Orleans assumptions, you know, because it's distributed system and all. So we're looking at potentially revamping that in the future to use a storage-backed system on Service Fabric. So Service Fabric has this thing called the property store, which is I don't know if that's the official name, but that's what it used to be called, which is essentially the same as Zookeeper or etcd. And so I'm looking into that. I've got a prototype approach for it, a prototype implementation for it, and maybe we'll merge something like that in the coming months, but not in the next few weeks, not for 2.0. Now, in addition to the clustering provider, we definitely have the hosting provider, which allows you to host Service Fabric services on Orleans silos on Service Fabric as either stateless services or stateful services. And that's in the docs now. So there are basic documentation and samples showing how to use hosting and clustering on Service Fabric.
Okay, thank you, Robin. So see, Al asked about will it be able to call grain via HTTP or call this silo? Oh, we've had this desire to have built-in support for HTTP for quite some time, and it keeps slipping with other priorities. So I think at this point it's post 2.0.
Yeah. Another question from Ashkan. Any plans for making reminders more scalable?
We have an issue for that, and I think our colleagues on Skype in London looked at it a couple of years ago. So we kind of don't have any burning reason to do it, but we welcome help and contribution on that.
And is there any focus on or work being done on secure communication between client and silo to silo?
Oh, that's another excellent question. So just last week, there are two conversations with two external customers of Orleans that wanted to work with us and contribute support in some form for TLS for securing encrypting communication. So I don't know if Austin is here. No, he's not on the call. It's one of them. So we'll see. The hope is that we can add a simple solution in reasonable amount of time, short. And then there is a bigger question of, again, in the spirit of getting out of business where we don't provide core value, externalizing or better say outsourcing the whole network stack, like we experiment with .NET. So that's a longer term and big effort in the future potentially.
Another question, which is now you're all on .NET Core, are you still using Visual Studio on Windows, or are you all using Macs with VS Code?
I think all of us here in the core team still use Visual Studio. We're conservative.
Well, I actually use Visual Studio Code a little bit, but yeah, still on Windows. Yeah.
I found it quite liberating on VS Code.
Well, it depends. I typically use Visual Studio fully for like doing like bigger work, but for smaller reviews or like testing something fast or open, the Visual Studio Code is very lightweight for that. So.
But this is where we can learn from you guys. If somebody shows here's the benefits and here's how I'm using, how I'm building my projects, very interesting.
Does anyone else have any more questions for the team?
Questions, suggestions, opinions. This is all wrong. So maybe I should mention timing. Oh, so somebody Al mentioned.
So Al's just saying it works, which is good.
Over the last 8 months in production. You mean 1.5, right, Al? Not 2.0 beta yet. Yeah. Yeah, because we hear from people that are running with 2.0 beta or the build from master, and they're running in Docker and Linux, and they say it all works. So we want to hear more of that. Timing-wise, so we released beta 2. We may need to release beta 3. We're debating that. We tried to assess the serialization issues with F#, if they warrant a special release or if nightly is enough for people who want to understand that. But in general, the big piece remaining is refactoring of providers, and that JSON updated the provider interfaces configuration. JSON updated the issue, and I think there's some good comments since then. So that's the big piece. And then we have a large number of smaller items to complete, like, for example, replace perf counters that are only Windows specific, something to consume memory and CPU information for logging, so that when people say we have a problem, we can see what they are running, environment they're running into. So nothing major, I think, is left outside of refactoring providers, and transactions will still be in beta. But because of the holidays, I don't see how we can complete it before the end of the year. Probably slip into January with probably RC or maybe a couple RCs.
I was wondering if you notice any performance improvements or regressions from switching to .NET to .NET Core.
We on the full .NET, I don't think we're not testing on .NET Core, so we're testing a full .NET. In that sense, we don't see any difference. Mm-hmm. We're not measuring. I think we get more performance improvements from long series of PRs by Dimitri, by here and there, 20%, 30%, and now he wants to rewrite the old scheduler with some very promising results. Yeah, the moment we measure on that .NET Core, we'll be able to tell if there's any difference.
Yeah,
there's a lot of confusion between ASP.NET and .NET Core performance.
And yeah, so most of our own testing on .NET Core is manual. We're not really benchmarking anything yet, but yes, hopefully very soon. Like, that's the walk phase. So yeah, we'll start having some numbers soon.
Question
by the way, we are benchmarking still on full.NET using 2.0, that for sure, and that is what Sergey was mentioning, that it's stable. It's not an improvement or a regression there.
Yeah, good. That's kind of what you'd expect, I think, isn't it?
But in general, maybe I said it several times before, like all releases we put out, like beta 2, they all technically production ready, but they all fully tested. It's not like it's untested piece of code, and people go in production with those releases. We still mark them as pre-release because they're beta. But in terms of test coverage, except for areas that explicitly flag, like transactions, and in this case, they're all stable.
Boban is asking about a bug to do with SMS streams disconnecting when it doesn't do an auto retry, does it? Go and look at the issue.
Jason or Xiao, do you want to jump and say about SMS client, the subscription? What your thoughts are?
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit. It's kind of a long-standing issue with the structure of Orleans streams. It just kind of makes it difficult to handle recoverable scenarios on the client. Again, based on the structure of streams, so we can't really fix it without restructuring streams dramatically. There are a series of mitigations and things we can do, which we've been kind of introducing slowly over time. The first was to have the streaming infrastructure actually detect when a client has gone away and clean up the subscriptions, and that creates some warnings, but mostly works. The next was to allow the client to know when it was disconnected from the cluster, so it can make decisions. Like in most of the environments we have, the production environments internally that have this kind of behavior, when the client loses connection to the cluster, it just restarts. But that at least gives the signal to, hey, I've lost connection to the client or the cluster, I should restart. But doesn't actually give it any real recovery logic. The next piece would be to detect when if a client reconnects to the cluster, and adding a signal for that, and then adding wiring to cache the subscription information and resubscribe or recreate the subscription information when it reconnects. Those are basically series of changes that could be added in the future to get this to work. And like anything else, it's just a question of time and effort, right? This work is not necessarily trivial, and it's hard to test, and it's so. Yeah, it's, as far as I know, we don't currently have any time scheduled to fix these. We're aware of them. We kind of have a plan in place, and we're hoping the community can kind of chip in and help us out fixing some of these things when they need these capabilities. But it's really related to the structure of streams that it makes it hard to solve this problem.
Thank you, Jason.
Okay, so you is asking how is code managed in Grain? Is there a similar concept of session scope? Well, it's not really a session scope. It's an activation scope, and it's entirely for a particular activation, and it's entirely coupled to the dependency injection. So it's not something that survives activations or anything like that. The most appropriate way to look at it is look at the request services scope in ASP.NET. There's a lot of documentation about it, and this is very, very similar. It's just that our service provider scope lasts longer, lasts for the entire activation of the Grain. And then Sebastian says, I hope that answers to your question. I don't know if that's exactly what you were hoping for. And Sebastian asked, will you consider co-hosting with the new host builder? Yes, we briefly touched on that, but that's the goal. They are planning to release all this work in Microsoft Extensions hosting package in 2.1, I believe, timeframe for them, not for Orleans. And after that, like, our goal is to switch to that. And we created our own abstractions in the meantime, but they align almost entirely with them. So yeah, the plan is you will be able to co-host with them.
So related to the hosting, we specifically named our builder, our silo host as a silo host because it embodies having a silo and a hosting logic all put together in one builder or one class, and we did that in part because that's the most common scenario, and that is how our previous silo worked. So the silo was the host and everything was together, so it made it easy for us to port that logic. But once we move to once ASP.NET gets their host builder in place, we will still likely have, and this is up in the air because we're still figuring these things out, but likely have a silo builder, not a silo host builder, a silo builder in which you can build a silo within a host. And this gives the ability for someone who already is using a hosting infrastructure, either in a web server or in their own services, to spin up a silo within an existing host or host a silo itself. So it gives them more flexibility. So if someone has an existing infrastructure and an existing hosting infrastructure that they want to just throw a silo in there and so they have a place that's part of a cluster that they can start doing taking advantage of an actor model in an existing service framework, they can do that without having to spin up an entire host simply for that purpose. I hope that makes some degree of sense.
I think Richard already answered a question in chat from Sam.
Any other questions from anyone on the call?
So one piece there that I think you didn't answer is is it possible to auto-generate grain interfaces from grain implementation classes? I look at it, it's not what Orleans does, but with Roslyn and those kind of functionality, it should be possible to write some kind of piece of code that would do that for you if that's what you need. Usually it's the other way around. You declare your contracts and that's what your client has, but implementation can evolve and it's isolated.
I think we've exhausted all the questions, Sergey.
Well, actually, I have one now, but I don't know how much more time we have. Sergey, I don't recall us talking much about in-place upgrades during this presentation.
That would be very interesting to hear.
But I know there's been some work on that. I don't know if it's specifically related to 2.0. Maybe that wasn't in why it's not in here. But that question regarding grains, auto-generating the interfaces from grains, that made me wonder about how that would work in an in-place upgrade, which made me wonder: do we have anything we want to report in place in terms of the in-place upgrade for 2.0, or is everything still roughly the same as was in 1.5?
So when it comes to in-place upgrade, the functionality was already in 1.5. So the effort as part of 2.0 is to add mostly test infrastructure on our side to detect any kind of break-in changes in the future and test that we're backward compatible, so that starting from 2.0, future versions of Orleans are much more conscious about not making break-in changes, or be aware when break-in changes needed, be explicit, as opposed to previously the priority was to move fast and not worry too much about compatibility of 1.3 to 1.4 and 1.5. So that's the emphasis to more on testing that we're backward compatible. I think Attila confirmed that the existing Roslyn functionality in VS helps with extracting interfaces. Good.
Cool. I think we've pretty much had a wrap there, I think.
Yeah, and then we have Gitter, we have issues with the conversation
yeah.
stuff. So nothing really prevents the communication.
So sometime in January we can be expecting some new packages to arrive.
Yeah, I think somebody asked a couple of weeks ago, and they said, well, our releases are generally kind of completeness and quality driven. We have this luxury for some reason. I don't know why. So we're not date driven and say, yeah, we want to release by this date and we'll cut everything and whatever, squeeze where we can. So we were close, but of course we're slipping from where we hope we would be. Yeah, but we're close enough.
Great stuff. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to explain everything that's in 2.0, and thank you for all your hard work and the great presentation, and we look forward to getting our hands on it.
Well, again, thanks to the whole community for being part of it, and that's part of the enjoyment of the core team to deal with all this, work with all these people. Thank you, Richard, for hosting these meetups, and we should do it more often because we kind of go up and down in frequencies.
Well, the frequency is kind of determined by the content that's offered. So if anyone has anything interesting they'd like to talk about, please let me know, or put an issue in the meetups repository, because we'd love to have more of these, and but that can only really happen if we have interesting people to talk about interesting stuff. So please volunteer your topics. Well, thank you very much. Have a happy holidays, everyone, and catch you next year.
Yep.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Thank you.